So without any further ado, I would like to welcome back on stage Herman van Eycken and John Seale.
Thanks. This one I need to change my glasses, I'm afraid, and make it a little bit comfy. Bear with me for a second.
Are they going to run that clip there?
Not yet, I think.
Oh, okay. Story of my life.
But you're going to see more than one clip, actually. I'm going to keep this short because, of course, when you talk about John Seale and you have the man sitting next to you, whatever words that I will use will actually pale very quickly when you hear the man talk himself. You will see that. But I'm going to just start with the classical thing that I need to do so that we exactly know who do we talk about here. So John Seale is an Australian cinematographer, a director of photography. He did win an Oscar for his work of the 1996 film The English Patient, a milestone in film history, actually. And of course, he is a member both of the Australian Cinematographer Society and the American Society of Cinematographers, seeing that he's worked so often in the United States as much as in Australia. He was born in Queensland, in Warwick. So he is from here, 3 hours away, I've been told. And
I was there for 6 weeks.
Yes, he lived all his life in Sydney and still lives there. So he received Oscar nominations, and that is no small BA already, for his work on Witness, on Rain Man, Cold Mountain, and of course he did win, as I mentioned, the English Patient. He even directed one film as well.
No, won't talk about that.
Yes. And then he had, of course, these incredible commercial successes that he's been working on Harry Potter, again Rain Man, The Prince of Persia, The Sands of Time, The Perfect Storm, The Tourist. They were incredible, big successes.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Just to imagine how big they were, the biggest one grossed, $974 million US. So, what we were all surprised, we as much in the film schools as in the profession, that he had said that he was in retirement, but he came back out of his retirement in 2012. So I think he will now not go back to retirement anymore because he came back to shoot Mad Max Fury Road. For again, he did get an Academy Award nomination.
Hey. Can't trust old guys, can you?
So let's play a little clip that shows us a little bit of what this man has been.
Thank you very much.
I told you it was going to be amazing, wasn't it? So, John, you have to start somewhere to get to this.
Warwick.
No, because you left it as a baby. So, what really got you into it?
No, I was one of those young men back in the 50s, 1950s, in high school that didn't have an idea of what I wanted to do professionally in any way or form, which made it difficult, obviously, to select a track through the education system that was available back then. And so I wandered through my exams and didn't do that well, and really sort of got odd jobs in Sydney. But I found out that I had an uncle that I'd never met that had a big sheep station out here at Longreach, and decided that the city wasn't holding anything for me. So I came up to the Gold Coast and met him, and he said, "Do you want a jackaroo on the place?" And I thought, why not? I've got nothing else down in Sydney. So I decided to go out there and work, but I took a little 8mm camera with me, and it was purely really to record the life on a sheep station and send it back to my parents. But after 18 months and something like a 2.5, 3 year drought prior to that time, and then of course during that 18 months it didn't get any better, suddenly one night the drought broke and it rained like crazy all night, and the next day we lost 3,000 head of sheep overnight. They all got bogged in the black soil, and we couldn't get tractors and jeeps, and horses couldn't get out there to, the black soil, as you know, we just clogged up on the horses, and they were breaking legs, and tractors were bogging down and couldn't get through it, and we just couldn't save 3,000. So I thought, this is not for me. 30,000 acres and 5,000 head of sheep's not a great future. And I looked at the little camera and I thought, wouldn't it be fantastic to go around the world, go to places where people weren't able to go, weren't game to go, couldn't afford to go, whatever. But I could go, maybe, National Geographic style, and shoot documentaries. So with that in mind, I set off back to Sydney, hitchhiked my way back home, and then a year later I was able to join the ABC. And back then the ABC had a lot of money. They had 26 cameramen on their books there the whole time. Each cameraman had an REST and a Bell and Howell wind-up, and they were deployed out of the ABC through all of the facets of news gathering, documentary gathering, rural documentaries, Four Corners type shows. In fact, Four Corners was running back then. And I spent 3 hours there with a friend of a friend who was a cameraman, and that was it. As far as I was concerned, that's it. So I spent the next 6 months trying to get into the ABC, finally got in as a driver.
How old were you then?
Quite young.
Well, he still is quite young, I think, but yeah. Cool.
I was 19 or something, 19 and a half, I think, by the time I got back out of the scrub up there and got into the ABC. And I had 7 years there, and I loved it. I loved every minute of it. But it was funny back then in the late 50s, early 60s, because a lot of friends of my father's would say, "Clem, what's the boy doing?" He'd say, "Well, he's at the ABC, he's working with cameras and things." Oh. Well, when's he going to get a proper job? And that was the call back then. My school said I'd be a good plumber. And sometimes I wish I'd been a plumber. Pay less tax. But as I said, at that stage it wasn't a proper job. There were no film schools, there were no training departments at all. You just got a job and joined the School of Hard Knocks. And they were all wonderful old, grizzly old cameramen who'd survived the Second World War, a lot of them as combat cameramen. One of them had survived Korea. He was one of the first people captured in Korea and spent 4 years in a Korean jail during the Korean War. And they used to do Russian roulette with the revolvers on him every week. He survived all that, but he was a cameraman there at the ABC. He was mad, quite mad. Much better when he was drunk. Calmed down a bit. But they were the sort of guys, rough and tumble, but they were really good gruff teachers, and they taught you all the proper ways to make films. So it was a very, very good 7 years. And I was able to do they rotated you. So I was able to do news, Four Corners type thing, rural documentaries, and we'd travel all over Australia and do rural stuff and Four Corners stuff, news gathering in Sydney and Canberra. All of that was great research and learning into feature filmmaking. I know it sounds difficult, but being prepared, being in a car rushing to a riot in Sydney and the cameraman saying, with his light meter out the window, saying, preset all the lenses at 5.6. We'll go in at 5.6 and leap out of the car and start shooting. And all of the lenses would be preset on a hyperfocal distance, which is your maximum depth of field at, say, 5, 6 or 8, whatever he selected. So we'd leap out of cars and straight into the riot, shooting. And even with the little wind-up cameras, you'd preset all the 3 lenses, and you'd do the wide shot, and then you'd rotate the turret into the medium shot without stopping the camera. So it was all lovely learnings of speed. And I can't tell you how much that's held me in good stead in international filmmaking, like those films up there, that speed is an essence that everybody loves. Directors love it because it keeps actors hot. Actors love it because they stay hot, because you're quick enough to turn around and say, we're ready, and the actor hasn't got out of character. Editors love it, because it's a faster continuity turnaround that is more accurate. So everybody loves that speed, and I learned all that in the hallowed halls of the ABC. Not the same now, of course.
Yes. But then you really, really developed very quickly towards feature filmmaking in Australia. And you met some very interesting encounters there.
Interesting?
Encounters.
Oh, well, of course.
Like Peter Weir, for instance.
Eh?
Like Peter Weir, for instance.
You can't, yes. Years later, 7 years of that, but the original cameraman that took me into the ABC was a very big, wonderful man who had a lot of good, solid philosophies of filmmaking. Broke away from the ABC and went down and joined Skippy, the Bush Kangaroo group, who were a couple of blocks away. And he kept trying to talk me into leaving and going down there, because at that stage I was operating cameras at the ABC. The ABC suddenly decided about 4 years in to start shooting episodic television. And to do it, their thinking was, we've got to get the best cameras and we've got to get the best of this and the best of that. They had the money to do it. So they bought this great big Mitchell R35, about half the size of a Volkswagen, and it took 4 of us to lift it onto this great big Worrell head with the handles. and we shot episodic TV on that, 16, 17 hours a day, 6 days a week shooting on that, with a minimal crew. And whereby I'd thought that I might travel the world with a little 16mm camera shooting landscapes and glaciers or whatever.
It became the opposite.
Huh?
It became the opposite.
I ended up outback shooting that background, the outback background, which was so lovely. But now we had actors in front of that background, between the camera and the background. Well, that was like so exciting, one of the first ones we did way out back with Bill Grimm and lighting and operating, and I was focus pulling and clapper loading, doing everything else, was with Jackie Weaver. Jackie Weaver was 17 then, and every time I see her now, it's a hail hearty, well met, because we were there. I was 23 or something, and she was 17. And we were out back making movies, and it was a very early stage of the Australian industry, and it was very exciting. And, we have a great time remembering that. So then I left. I did leave. I went and joined Fauna. We came up to the Barrier Reef and did a Barrier Reef series. And then by then, the Australian industry had broken away from having film houses that employed people. And the freelance system started very quietly, and a few guys broke away and waited at home for the phone to ring. And over about 18 months or 2 years, more and more did that, until finally there was a very good and comprehensive group of people had broken away and become freelancers. So then people could just ring up and say, I need a cameraman next week for 3 days, who have you got? And it started the freelance agencies. There's now, I think, 3 in Sydney, 3 agencies in Sydney, and pretty well everybody works that way, as not many people have people on full time anymore. So I got into that, and that, of course, segued then into local Australian films, because I was a camera operator, and I was lucky enough to be able to join up with the great Russell Boyd and Peter James and those boys who were, some of them were actually, Peter and Russell were both younger than I was, but I loved operating, and they moved up into lighting, and I opted to stay as an operator. I thought the operating of the camera was the best job in the world, and still is. But back then they were the young guys, and they were the young beginners of the Australian film, feature film renaissance. And Peter Weir and
Bruce
Beresford and all of those boys, Phil Noyce and the boys, all grabbed these, Russell Boyd mainly, and I was lucky to be operating for Russell. So I segued into the Australian feature film industry.
So you did then with Peter Weir at a certain moment Gallipoli.
I did 3 pictures for Russell Boyd operating for Peter Weir. And then all of a sudden, the whole thing turned around. Peter rang and he said he had a film to do in America, and would I be available? Which at that time, I think Don McAlpine was the only Australian cameraman who'd broken away and gone international. But suddenly Peter was asking me to go overseas, and it was for a film called Mosquito Coast, which I think I've got one fan, any more takers on Mosquito Coast, yeah. But it bombed. We were over there in Belize, Central America, with the mosquitoes and the flies and the snakes, and they suddenly said, get on a plane, get home quickly. It's crashed. But 6 weeks later, Peter rang. He said, I've got another film. It'll go very quickly. Can you do it? And I had a few commercials lined up, and I cancelled those and said, yep. And so we went over and did Witness, and that changed the whole boxing match.
It was a huge film, actually, on all fronts. It was big for Peter Weir.
Yeah.
It brought you to the US, so you moved, in a way, to another territory, another level. Yeah. What were your first impressions of doing that? Because it's not as simple as it sounds, you know. Now, of course, with retrospect from now, we can see that a lot of actors have done it, a lot of other people have done it. From Australia, Australia is very well and highly regarded here, but you were among the very first. And not just making it, but making it very big very soon with a film like this.
Well, I've got to be honest, I was terrified. I mean, Australia was Australia, and it was a lovely little place where I knew everybody, and everybody were friendly, and we were all just making movies, and it was a very friendly atmosphere. Hollywood was Hollywood, and to walk through that hallowed arch of Paramount Pictures, looking around and thinking, oh my gosh, this is where it's all going to start. Plus the fact that Harrison was in the lead, and he was Mr. Indiana Jones at that time, and he was the biggest box office star in the world. And then suddenly this little guy from Warwick, Queensland, was going to suddenly have Harrison Ford in front of his camera. And I didn't know really how they made films. I didn't know what their communication was or anything. And I was terrified, to be honest. But, and I think the producer, we were all pretty young then, as you could see. You could see even Harrison was young, God. We're exactly the same age, actually, and almost to the day. But I think the producer took one look at me and rang and booked an American cameraman because I looked like some kid, had a lot of towselly black hair and walked in, you know, like gaga at all of this Paramount Pictures thing. But Peter was great, settled us in, we prepped the film, it was very quick. And he was fantastic as far as an American studio picture was concerned with a man like Harrison. They got on well, they talked intelligently about the role, the part, the film. And so all of that was laid out, that was lovely. I had to take an American crew. I didn't know how they thought or worked or anything. But so blazed into it, and I got thrown about 3 weeks in by an East Coast focus puller. Lovely guy. We're great friends now and always will be and always have been. But he threw me right out of the ring. We were shooting a quick little scene in the barn, and I knew Peter wanted 3 shots, a wide shot, close-up, and a close-up. That's all he needed. And I came back after lunch, and this barn was a beautiful circular barn with a lovely translucent fiberglass window light for daylight. And the light was beautiful. It was this band of light across the thing, and the fill was perfect, quick meter readings, and thought, this is perfect. We can shoot this available light. So I grabbed the American first assistant director and I said, let's go. This is available light. We can have this done by 3 o'clock, and we'll be down the pub by 4, you know. And he went, you're not going to get it, you know. And I said, yeah, but why not? You know, Harrison's ready. I can hear on the two-way radios, he's ready to go, and no, you'll never get it. It just wasn't their way of thinking. So Peter came in and he said, how are you going, Johnny? How long before we're ready? I said, we're ready, Peter. And it's perfect. Look at it. Beautiful, available light. We could have it done by 3:30. And Peter said, what's the problem? I said, First AD doesn't feel that we can get it all together. Really? Watch this. He went out and just started knocking on doors. Harrison, we're ready out there. Come on, everybody out. Boom, boom. And we got it with available light. And it's in the movie, and it fits the movie perfectly. But the focus puller said to me, he said,
You can't do that.
why didn't you tent the whole barn? And I said, what do you mean? Tent it. He said, yeah, black it out and relight it for that. I said, but why? It would take 2 days to tent it. He said, yeah. But I said, we did it in 2 hours. And he said, yeah, but I said, is that how the big boys would do it here? They'd tent it out? And he said, yeah, they'd tent the whole thing out and go back and relight it with big arc lights or whatever back then. And I thought, oh no, I'm doing this all wrong. Maybe that's what they are expecting. So I went to Peter and I said, Peter, I'm worried. He said, what about? And I said, I told him quickly, and he's a very intelligent man, very quick. And he solved the problem in 1 sentence. He said, Johnny, don't forget one thing. You're working on an Australian film here. It's just that 99% of the crew have a funny accent. I said, Peter, thank you. And we blasted that film, came in on schedule. Producer and studio couldn't believe that a foreign director, foreign cameraman had walked into that film and come in on schedule. They couldn't believe it. They said, that will open the doors of Hollywood for you. And then we all got nominated, and that opened the door, even both doors. And we went from, you know, dirty cabs picking us up at the airport to clean limos.
But so you had, of course, as you mentioned, Harrison Ford with you there. He was happy to do it with the available light quickly. So the importance of actors and actresses is something that for your job as a cinematographer is a very important one, right? We do know it's important for the directors because they have to make them perform, but there is always a very special relationship between a cinematographer and an actor, or an actress, for that matter. What's your experience in that?
Shoot them. No, They're a wonderful group of people. They have an extremely hard job to do. They have to find another character than their own. They have to build themselves into that character and make it work for the written script that they're presented with, and then go out in front of cameras and present it, and we shoot it. So their job's very difficult. It did take a while for me to learn about this, and it sort of was like osmosis. It slowly crept in because I started to ask them about things like the clapperboard. You know, you've seen that black thing with the stripes on it, and they slam that down. It's to synchronise image and sound, obviously. And I'd watch them very carefully, because I was operating as well. I'd watch them very carefully, and some actors had, you know, the clapper would go, some butch young man would be standing there, and suddenly they'd say, roll cameras, you know, right, mark it. And he'd go, slate 79, take one, bam, and he'd walk off. And you'd see the actor go, and I'd think to myself, he just lost his character, because the clapperboard just intruded into his character and his thinking and his psyche. And so I'd go to those and I'd say, what do you think of the clapperboard? You know, I hate it. So I'd say to them, you know, can we do an end slate at the end of the shot? When the director says cut, you bring it in upside down so the editor knows that it's an end slate because it's upside down, and then clap it, and the actor's finished doing what he or she needs to do. So, and other actors would say, I love it. I hide behind it, and I find myself, I get myself into the role, and I'm not worried about the sound and the bang and the guy walks stomping off. They said, I love it, and I hide behind it. So I tried to work the actors as to what they liked, but certainly started to realise that we can intrude technically into their space, and it's detrimental to the film. So I started like marks on the floor, and once again lighting and operating, I'd watch the actors' eyes, and they'd be walking into a room, and they had to hit a mark there, and you know, you don't want them looking at the mark, because that's obviously. And then they'd start their lines as a dead giveaway, although Spencer Tracy was a master at it. Total master. He'd look down at his mark as though it was sort of something he was contemplating in dialogue. He was brilliant for it, but most of the others aren't, I can assure you. So I tried to then, over the years, worked out with focus pullers who hated me, to take away marks, so that the marks on the floor, not the actor marks, but there were marks on the floor that gave them their range. And, you know, 5 foot, 5 foot 6, 6 foot. So if the actor didn't hit the mark we wanted, the focus puller could see quickly that he'd overridden by 6 inches, and he could then readjust the lens to that. And I worked that system a lot, because many, many takes were repeated because the actor searching for his marks. And it got to a stage that the mark was more important than the performance. And I thought, no, this is crazy. We can't do this. We shouldn't be doing this. We can't distract the actor to that point, that the mark is more important. Because then they'd hear cut and they'd say, how'd I do? And I used to think, that's not right. He's worried about whether he's on his mark while he's doing his lines. Not good. So I tried to eliminate that and tried to give the actors as much of their space as they could. Sometimes it was detrimental. There was an Irish actor in Canada who had to blaze into this room, waving a .45 automatic around, and had to spin around and stop and point it at somebody. Well, he missed the mark every time. He was way out, and the focus puller was going crazy, and I thought, the focus puller's not as good as he could be to accommodate that. So there's a problem, and the actor's going nuts and far too. So I said to the actor, how can we help you find the mark? Well, he said, just put a line of sandbags here. That I know that's my parameters. Okay, done. So our grip guys who do all that sort of thing, and they kind of made a joke of it. They made it about this high, right round. Well, the actors roll cameras, bang, clapper went on, and the actors, action. And he came raging into the room with this 45. He spun around, and I'm watching through the camera, and he spun around, he went boom, out of shot, and the camera's empty. And I thought, I tilted down, there he was. He's got his knees over the sandbags, he flattened his back, and he said, "Who the put that there?" And we said, "Well, you asked to put them there." He said, "Get rid of those bloody things," you know. So we have a lot of fun. But the space is so important, and I think that you get to work with somebody like Sigourney Weaver, who's in Gorillas in the Mist is a giant. You've got a director there who desperately wanted to make the story of Dian Fossey in Africa. The studio turned around and said, "Okay, let's do it on a soundstage where we've got total weather control, we've got ape control because there'll be guys dressed up, and we'll make it like that Tarzan movie, which Michael Apted and I, the director, and I, we watched 3 or 4 times and decided you couldn't do it that way. They always looked fake. They looked like guys, the little hairy guys running around, you know, rather than a proper gorilla. Because when you see the proper gorillas and how they walk and how they yawn in the middle of the shot, you know, our little hairy guys weren't doing that. So that's in our rehearsals. So Michael talked them into going to Africa in amongst the real gorillas. Well, that's pretty exciting, I can tell you, because they're wild, and we had to be taught how to behave just as they do in the film, where you hit the deck and you grab something and the highest thing in the air is your bottom, so that you're submissive to the silverback. Sigourney took all that. She loved it. She loved all of that. She loved Dian Fossey. She loved the movie. She loved everything about it. And she simply loved going into Africa to do it. And she was a giant because Michael wasn't there to direct her. And there were many, many times she went in with the real gorillas, as you can see in the clips. And she knew the script back to front. And she knew that the gorillas were going into scene 83. So she would go into scene 83. And then half an hour later, she'd look at them and she'd think, this is scene 106. So she would do scene 106. So she made the film out there. And so when you're working with somebody like that, this is what we had to learn to do, all this eating stinging nettles. When you're working with a woman like that who is so dedicated to the subject matter and in the making of the film, you've just got to bow down to these people and kiss their feet, because she made that film. And I know that Michael Apted, the director, is so thankful that she had somebody like Sigourney who was prepared to go in there and get beaten up by real silverbacks. Occasionally in there, to aid cutting purposes in edit, there's fake heads. We built a lot of animatronic heads of gorillas, which took about 10 guys to operate. You know, eyelids and tongues and mouths and ears and everything had to be operated by individuals. So there was a lot of that. That was shot later in London on a sound stage because they had too much moisture problems in Africa. So they went back to London and we shot those later. But basically, most of it is set with the real gorillas, with Sigourney in amongst them. And she's an absolute legend in my mind.
So you have actors and actresses who make it really possible for you to go really beyond what you would have probably thought you would be able to do. How about directors who kind of surprised you in such a way or worked with you in such a way that it lifted the entire film while you were making them, based on the relationship between you and the director?
Hope you've got all night.
No, but
the interesting thing is they're all different, and it's wonderful for that, of course. I have to be brutally honest and say that unfortunately I felt in the early days of working in America that the American cameraman didn't. The American cameraman felt that He was the boss of the visuals on the floor, and he would tell the director what to do, which was how it was in the early days of making films. The cameramen set all the angles and the shots and controlled the editing of the film. And I think the American was segueing out of that almost grudgingly into a situation where the director was now calling the shots, whereas I wasn't. I'd come through an industry learning where the director called the shots at all times, and we were there to listen, to record what he wanted, she wanted, and to enhance the best that we could his and her ideas, therefore the script's ideas. So it was a little bit of a shock sometimes working with American directors to find there was a different approach completely. Some of them were so fastidious about what they wanted. It was like, that was it, that's what we do, don't do anything else. Others, like the Rain Man director Barry Levinson, was so cool, it wasn't funny. We just sat and watched movies for 3 weeks, which is our pre-production. We're supposed to be talking about how the shot's going and what's happening and, you know, how do we cover this? He didn't want to know anything about that. So I finally got him to go to lunch. And I said, Barry, we've got to have lunch. I really want to talk to you about the look of the film. So we went to lunch, and I said, well, what do you think, Barry? And he had a soft cover book with him, and he slid it across the table and said, have a look at that. And it was a book on the coffee houses of Europe. And he said, that's it. I said, oh, okay. So we never had lunch. He just said, no, that's it. Let's just go and shoot it. Oh, okay. So we did. We just went and shot it. That's Rain Man. We just went and shot it. Drove across America from Cincinnati, where we started. Drove right across America, flew backwards and forwards and up and down, and we ended up in LA, and we just shot it. Whatever happened, we'd walk into Caesar's Palace and they'd say, you can have that area, you can have those 8 tables, and you can only shoot between midnight and 4 a.m. And so every 6 weeks, we'd be there for 4 hours shooting these scenes.
But you must have understood him because you got a nomination for it.
I know, that was a lucky mistake, that one. But sometimes I think over the years people try to classify you, you know, that you're an action cameraman or you're a romantic cameraman, you do nice romance type stuff or reality stuff or whatever. I tried never to be categorised by anybody, and I tried to select films that would show that diversity. But I also loved the idea, one of the questions, you know, you'd be sent a script. And people often say, how did you select to do a certain film? And I was lucky enough in the hot years to get 3 or 4 at a time. And you'd sit down and read. I would always read each one in its entirety without any distractions, put a stopwatch on it and just read it gently all the way through, read the dialogue, stage directions, all the way through to the end and look at the stopwatch. And I found that stopwatch, by reading stage directions, which would be, you know, a wide shot of this and the car drives up, things. And if you read it just gently and slowly, that was about the time that we would end up shooting and the editor would cut to in the final film. So I found that by reading it like that, I could work out how long the film might run. I would also then just sit there for a long time and think, if I had to pay $17 to sit in a seat for 2 hours and 10 minutes and watch that, would I be happy spending that $17? And if I could say yes, I'd accept the movie. But I also wanted to find out who was in it. I always thought it was very important to find out what actors had been approached and who had accepted those roles. And Children of Lesser God was an interesting little film about deaf people. And I read it, I thought, it's interesting, but I'm not too sure whether I'd, you know, I think it was $15 back then, would pay $15 to sit there and watch it. Who's in it? And they said, Bill Hurt. And I said, I'll do it. because Bill Hurt was just about to get nominated and did win an Academy Award for Kiss of the Spider-Woman. He's a brilliant actor. And he was showing that already, and as soon as they said Bill Hurt's signed on, I said, I'll do it, because I just love Bill Hurt's work. And it turned out to be quite an intense little movie, and was fairly well received as well. So all of that was very difficult sometimes. I missed a lot of that I would love to have done, and I didn't. When Harry Meets Sally, I was offered that, and I thought, what a funny, but I didn't know what Rob Reiner was going to do to it. And he made an incredibly wonderful little film. Years later, he signed me up to do The American President. Full American movie with American flags, president. And I said to him, in all honesty, I said, Rob, you sure you want me to shoot this? And he said, yeah, why? Why not? I said, well, I'm an Australian. Don't you want an American to shoot it? Oh, no, he said, you can shoot it. Go on. So I went off and shot it. And it was a lovely film to make. Michael Douglas and Annette Bening were wonderful to work with. Wonderful, wonderful people.
So you mentioned Peter Weir, how important he was he brought you and asked you to come to the United States. But there was another big encounter, I think, in your career, which was, of course, Anthony Minghella.
No.
So how did that came about?
Anthony had done 2 films prior to English Patient, and I think, like all the directors, when they approach you to make a film, they check out your background, your films, and they ring directors, and word of mouth comes through, like, what's he like? Has he got BO? Stuff like that. I think I've realised pretty sort of quickly that the speed of shooting that I'd learnt in Australia at the ABC was very advantageous, extremely advantageous, because when the word gets around you fast, but the results are good, they beat a path to your door. And sometimes you do a lot of sacrificing, where you'd love to add, wouldn't it be great to, wish I could have put a backlight in there, or wouldn't it have been nice to have thing, and you don't get the time. You think the actors are hot, they're ready to go, the actress is welling up, she's got to cry, and she's ready to go, and we're ready, and you just yell and you sacrifice your own job. On Rain Man in the early, was the turning point for me from a single camera shoot to multiple camera shoots, and I got in awful trouble with American cameramen about that. They thought I was shooting TV all the time, and I said, well, if you don't like the results, oh no, we love the result. Well, what's the problem with shooting TV if you like the results? But they didn't like the idea of putting multiple cameras, especially cross-shooting. They just could not handle that. And one American cameraman, very well-known, older cameraman, older than me, back then, he walked up to me one day in the American clubhouse, which is and said, so these multiple cameras that you're using, you're cross-shooting on that? And I said, absolutely. Best way to get it. Dialogue cutting for the editor, for the actors. They're hot. They can run. You don't have overlaps. It's fantastic. So you'd be prostituting your lighting. And I thought, here we go again. And I said, I paused for a little while to add the dramatics. Yes, I am, but only 20%. I never go more than 20%. And he looked at me, turned, walked away. Didn't want to hear. Because they didn't like the idea of any cameraman, or they call them director of photography, sacrificing his lighting, that each shot had to be carefully lit. And I was well out of that stage then, and the multiple camera, I found over the years, I never did not go with multiple cameras after that, and we got up into Harry Potter's and Mad Max. Mad Max was 20 odd, but a lot of those were crash cameras that we quickly placed around and smashed those. But like Harry Potter was 6 cameras rolling on pretty well every scene. If we couldn't fit them in, of course, we'd use 4 or 3 or 5, whatever we could fit in and would be productive. There was no point in shooting multiple cameras if they weren't productive to the editor. So I found that a lot of the times the camera operators would start to pal up with another camera because that angle had a nice background or it was a nice angle or whatever. And I'd quickly check it and say, no, you get back over there because the editors can only use one of those. There's no point in wasting money and energy and time shooting it twice from the same angle. Hoof it back where it was and cross-shoot onto this girl here or this boy here. So I had to battle sometimes with people to make sure that their camera angles were productive enough for an editor to be able to use in a cutting process within that scene. So that was a battle, but it paid dividends on Rain Man because of the writer's strike. The actors couldn't change their dialogue off the original script, but of course they were. They were ad-libbing, so they weren't writing it down. They were just ad-libbing. And where they dropped the toothpick scene and Raymond looks down, Dustin looks down and starts counting the toothpicks, I suddenly realised that they were ad-libbing, and how would we get the reverse on Tom except that they'd have to go over to the sound department and sit there and listen to the replays of the dialogue so they could get the matching continuity dialogue to shoot that. And I raced over to Barry Levinson and I said, Barry, they're ad-libbing. Well, I'm Australian. And he looked at me and he went, duh. Because they had me, I should have known they were ad-libbing and duh. So I said, we should be cross-shooting with another camera. He said, I wasn't going to ask, because it was in an era of single camera in America still. And I said, give me 2.5 minutes, I'll get the spare body out of the truck. We whacked the lens into it, put it on a tripod, and we started cross-shooting, and I've never stopped since, because it was so advantageous to everybody that I've just done it ever since, you know. And used zooms. Back then, everybody was using prime lenses, and I swung over to zoom lenses long before that and didn't worry about the quality drop between a prime lens and a zoom. And so I used zooms and multiple cameras ever since the 1970s, 80s or something.
So was it this kind of word of mouth that you were bringing all these new things in that made directors really knock on your door, and people like Minghella said, I want to meet this man, I want to work and do my next film with him?
I'm not sure whether it was the technical side of it or whether it was just simply that the final result on the screens were what they were looking for. Yeah. Maybe enhanced by phone calls to studios to say, how is he fast or slow, to directors, you know.
But something must have clicked very well, because not only it gave you very quickly the final award, where, you know, that's the top award in the world for the English patient, but you kept on working with him. Unfortunately, he left us early. He could have made still plenty of films.
Well, Anthony,
sadly, but he was he must have been very keen on your work, because he kept on working with you in all his consequent films.
Well, I think a lot of that was not necessarily the end result that he got and was happy with. It was getting those shots was an amicable arrangement of what-ifs or planning off storyboards. And I used to give, you know, shooting on location back then was mostly a 6-day week, you know, 14 or 15-hour days. But I'd always go round to his place, any director's place, on a Sunday and do half a day. Ron Howard was the same. I used to go upstate New York, drive up there and spend a half a day with him. We'd nut out the next week's shoot, and they loved that. They loved that fact that you give you time off to go and sort it out with them. And I think all of that was a package that came, and after English Patient and the success of it, of course, Anthony was very much a family man, and I think that he wanted to keep the feeling of a family on the set as well, a compatible, cooperative family on the set. He liked that way of making films, and I think I think all directors like that. There was, in that changeover of the American systems of director of photography ruling the set, George Miller tells a very fascinating story when he did Witches of Eastwick. He got a very, very well-known American cameraman who came out of Czechoslovakia in the early days to shoot it for him, because this cameraman had worked his way into being one of Hollywood's top directors of photography. And Jack Nicholson walked on the set, and Bill Mosh was yelling at everybody saying, "You must spot this up, you must do that." And Jack didn't like it, and George and I were talking about this space for actors out on Fury Road, and he was telling me this story about how Jack walked in and with his script and stood in the middle of the floor, and all you could hear was Vilmos yelling to his crew about the lighting and where the camera goes, and Jack just picked his script up and slammed it on the floor, and there was a mighty bang, and the whole set stopped and looked around. And Jack said, "That's better." And he walked past George and just winked at George and walked off the set. And it was his little way of saying, "Stop the noise. I don't want to hear the technician's problems." And that's culminated, in fact, in what I'd been trying to figure out in my brain in the earlier days of giving the actors the space, of being able to say, "We're ready." And doing that, on a movie with Richard Dreyfuss, he came up to me and he said, "Johnny, how long to turn around? 180 degrees, you're going to turn the camera around now, do the reverses." And I always am pre-lighting as I'm shooting. So I said, "Richard, about 8 minutes." And he went, No, John.
That can't be true.
You have to take the camera off, put the tripod in the dolly, and you have to turn the camera around. And I said, 8.5 maybe. And he said, no. I said, "Well, what are you getting at, Richard? Tell me what you're getting at." He said, "Can I go and have a sleep?" I said, "No way in the world, pal. You're on set within 10 minutes. 10 minutes. And he said, okay, went off. He came back, and at the end of the movie, he said, "I've never worked so wonderfully in my life." He said, "You're so fast." He said, "I never had time to get out of character." He said, "On the last film that I did," he said, "hour and a half, 2 hours, every shot to light it." I said, "Man, it must have looked great." And he went, "No, we reshot half of it, it was too dark." I said, "You've got to be joking. You spend that much time lighting something and it's too dark and you've got to reshoot it?" He said, "Unbelievable." But he said, with your set running, he said, "I never got out of character. I'd go back to the motorhome. I didn't even have time to ring my agent. Next minute they're knocking on the door saying, 'You're on, you're on.'" He said, "I couldn't believe it. I was still in character." And I kept thinking to myself, that must make a better film. If the actors are comfortable and hot and in character, that must make a better film. So I just continued doing that and bulldozing my way through it.
So in your last and very successful experience again with George Miller, there was a specific way that he wanted to work with the center frame.
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit about that?
Well, George is fascinating. He is, when you look at his body of work, it's, he's done a pig film about a little pig that talks. It's fantastic. He waited a couple of years before computer-generated imaging caught up with what he wanted to do. Quite happy to wait a couple of years before he started making it, because waiting for the computers to catch up. So he made that film and another one. Then he suddenly went off and did a penguin film, an fully animated penguin film. Amazing. But he'd done Mad Max originally in Melbourne and another two in Sydney for cinema, and now he's doing little penguin dancing films. So his mind is an amazing piece of mechanism that just digs deep into any kind of subject matter. So and then Lorenzo's Oil came along, and for some reason out of the blue he rang me to do Lorenzo's Oil, which is a very heavy drama about a small child that's dying and the parents, and it's a very powerful story. And he said to me, I'm not going to let the audience off the hook. They're going to be as distraught as the parents in the film. I'm not going to let them off the hook. And it's a very, very heavy film. So we did that, and I just loved the way he handled the visuals, and in a very simple, emotional and heavy drama film, what he did with the camera and his way of recording and why he was recording it in that way was fascinating and very simple in a way. There's a shot in there with Nick Nolte sitting there and Susan Sarandon, and he said, Johnny, just put the camera in the middle, put a track down, and we're going to track in very slowly, looking at their faces while the doctor tells them their son will irrevocably die. And if you watch Susan Sarandon in that movie, on that shot, it's awesome. And it's as simple as that. George doesn't ruin anything dramatically heavy by doing fancy coverage or fancy lens angles. He just set it up in front of them and let the audience just go straight into their brains. And when you watch Susan in particular, Nick's real good too, but Susan is awesome because she's a mother and a real earth mother. She loves children. She used to say, I'm not too sure who she was saying it to, but she'd often say on the set, I don't care who plants the seed, but I want the child. You'd look at this gorgeous woman. She was such a gorgeous woman. And you'd think... But when you look at her face, performing as a mother who's going to lose a child, it's awesome stuff. And I love George for just handling it so simply and beautifully and letting the actor be the movie, not the camera. And I think over the years I've learnt and tried to learn that the more you neutralise the camera, to me the better the film is. I mean, I'll go technical here for a little bit because I know there are students in the audience, but you know, that is a virtual window where filmmakers try to take you out of that seat and mentally transport you through that window into a new world that's being created for you by filmmakers. And I think the battle is to keep you there and keep you in that virtual world out there. And so one of the things that I learnt in the early days of filmmaking was this anal attitude towards continuity. That continuity flows in certain directions for certain reasons. People look right to left, left to right. And when you intercut it, they're definitely looking at each other because the cuts say right to left, left to right. So they must be looking at each other. If you do it the other way, they're both looking left to right. Who are they looking at? They're looking at somebody off screen over there. It's disjointing. But in the early days of filmmaking, can I keep going? Or
yes, of course, go
You're
on.
going to ring a bell or something?
No,
Okay.
I'm not going to ring a bell. If you need some water, I'll give you some water. But
So in the early days, these were instilled into my mind, this continuity. And over the years, practicing it or not practicing it became a learning lesson of a fluidity of a film that we're recording as cameramen and sound men and everybody on the set, of course, but recording images that will be laced together by an editor. And will that final result be a lovely, smooth storytelling visual line that keeps you in the movie? And with George, again, on Fury Road, we talked about, George would say, if I can get that audience in there, get them in their seat with their great big bucket of popcorn, and by the end of the movie, 2 hours later, it's still full because they forgot to eat it, I'll be really happy. And I think he's almost done it with Fury Road. It's a pretty wild movie. But there's a lot of things that he brought into it that are extraordinary. One is the levels of the script. There was no script for Fury Road. I came on literally 3 months before we started shooting, but they'd done 10 years prep. The film hadn't started, stopped, and another 5 years went by, and I think George did a Penguin film, and then they thought, oh, we better do Mad Max again. And so they got it going again. So he'd had a lot of time to think about it. When I arrived, I said, can I read a script? And they said, Johnny, there isn't one. And I said, go on. And they took me up to the Fury Road conference room and said, there's the storyboards, 2,500 of them. They start up in the top left there. You go up and down like that, all the way around the room, 2,500 times, and the movie finishes there. And I tried to follow it, and I couldn't work the story out to save my life on storyboards, because no dialogue in the movie either, so nothing was written about the progress of the story. So I didn't have a clue when I went in to shoot that film what we were shooting. So George had honed this film visually, but created the most amazing levels, for those of you who've seen it, of emotion between Furiosa, Charlize Theron character, and the 5 girls in the back, the brides. Why she was taking them out of the Citadel, why she was heading for the green place, and what happened when she got there, and what didn't happen when she got there. It's all her story. Max is just some piece of smelly rubbish that drives the truck occasionally, really, for the first half of the movie, and then he powers up a little bit. But all of that is George finding new levels of interpretation of women's roles in movies and women's abilities in movies. I believe, and I've read that one of the next scripts, it's actually, and I can tell you, it's actually Furiosa's story. So it's like change of, there'll be action in it, of course, because you've got to find out how she loses her arm, why she's a road warrior, how she became a road warrior, what is the green place, and that could be possibly another Mad Max film. But the way George handles these things is nothing short of incredible. 35 years before, I'd worked on an episodic TV show, and the director said, I want to be able to cut this argument scene really fast. You know, how can we make it so the audience doesn't have to search for the eyes? I want to be able to cut it so short that the audience, they don't have to chase across the screen. So the common compositional format that we were taught was that you always put them in the left of frame, so they're looking into the right of frame, which is empty, because just out of that frame is another person. And then when you shoot that person, they're like that with a bit of air. That was classic composition that we were taught. And this director said, can I put them in the centre? So that when I cut, the audience's eyes are just like bam, 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 bam. And so he can cut as fast as he would like. So we did that. Well, admittedly, it was on TV, and that was a 4:3 format, so there wasn't much room to really emphasise it. So we get onto Mad Max, and from day one, shot one, to the last day and the last shot, Johnny put the crosshairs on their nose all the way through the movie. The crosshairs are on the point of interest of that shot. And it wasn't to go... Some of the operators tried to frame for anamorphic. Oh, that looks good. I've got all the girls there, and I've got Max there, and I've got this and that thing. Next minute you hear, we had little earwigs in with George, Radio George. That's all you could hear was Radio George. And you'd hear, AJ, put the red dot on their nose. You know, and you'd see AJ go straight back. So that when he came to edit, the point of interest is always in the centre, even though it's an anamorphic frame, which is a very widescreen frame format. The point of interest in the middle at all times, and there's a clip we'll show you in a minute. Other things George does, because he did animated films on a computer, knew the value of the computer. The computers now for generated imaging are unbelievable. Unbelievable what they can do, and George knew the power of those. So George would if we had weather problems, you know, which was an age-old battle with one day the sun's out, next day it's foggy, we kept shooting. And I'd say to George, this won't match. We had sun yesterday, now we've got fog. He'd say, don't worry, Johnny, we'll fix it in post. And I'd say, oh, post, yeah, okay. Well, I knew the power of post. I didn't know how powerful it was, you know. So everything was fixed in post. We nearly had a T-shirt made, you know, don't worry, we'll fix it in post. But the thing was that George knew how he was going to edit it so fast. And later we talked about the fact that if anybody in the audience could see a mistake in the movie, then the shot's too long. So he uses the human reaction time of a frame to work out how long that shot will be, which I just find fascinating, because he's working a psychology into the, not necessarily the shooting of a film, because it's all done in editing and post, obviously, but he's working a psychology into his films that are very interesting, very deep and meaningful for the image and for the storytelling images. So I found the film totally fascinating to work on, and I think the end result is even more fascinating because he did a lot of work in post on this. It took 15 months to edit. It took 8 months to grade the film. Well, I couldn't spend 8 months there, so I used to pop in every month or so and catch up with what they were doing and try and help that way, and then disappear for another month and go fishing, sailing. And but the results, I could see where George were going, were just awesome. And I think the end film, in America, we had a guy in a Q&A, George and I had a Q&A in America, and this gentleman got up with his son and said, I'm a screenplay writer, my son is a screenplay writer, and we've seen the film 12 times, and we find new pieces of information every time in that film. And too many people said, I've seen it 3 times and I'm still finding new storylines in it. Other people say I'm going to go back and see it 4 more times, because it's that kind of a film. And I think that the privilege of being able to work with George on a film like that has been totally awesome. A good one to wrap up on.
Yes. Well, it was certainly a film.
Thank you.
That brought you back, and I don't think anyone wants you to leave again and go to in retirement. That's obvious. So I wanted to just wrap up with an obvious question, of course. You were part of the award ceremony earlier of the short films. So these are obvious young filmmakers, emerging filmmakers. What is your best piece of advice for these people? The ones that, you know, now really take a job in the film industry serious now, where they stand. It's 2016. With all that is ahead of us, with all that is happening now, what is your piece of advice?
Well, I find the digital revolution fascinating. There's an awful lot of people at my age who have shot all their lives on film negative and go to press saying that that's the only way to record a moving image, and there's the most beautiful way. And they're right. It was you know, Kodak and Fuji created some of the most beautiful film negative that you could ever photograph. Panavision and many lens companies around the world created the most beautiful lenses. Cameras were fairly static when you think about you know, the Mitchell movement in these cameras to push through, stop and pull through a 35mm frame every 24 times a second were brilliant, and honed by Panavision in particular. But there was always that nagging feeling that it's so old-fashioned. It's 110 years old, and you get in the desert with sand, and you get a bit of wind comes up and a grain of sand goes into the camera, and you could lose a whole roll of film by a scratch that's not picked up. It might be through the gate and out the other side of the gate and be scratching where the focus pull-up, when he takes the film out after every print take, he takes the film out and checks it for scratches. Laborious process and very dangerous process. We had to reshoot many, many times on films because of a scratch or a fogging or the discrepancies of film negative were enormous. And as the digital revolution came in, I looked at it and I thought, that's fantastic. Haven't got those problems. 400-foot load lasted for 3 minutes, 3 and a bit minutes, and a 1,000-foot load, which was a big lump of film, and hand holding that, you walked around, you ended up like Arnie Schwarzenegger at his prime, carrying a 1,000-foot load out the back and a great big lens in the front there. That was worth a 4X, I can tell you. But the whole thing was that it was all heavy, and you only had 9 minutes on the 1,000-foot mag, so you were running out of film in the middle of take, and actors hated it because you ran out and it was always the best take, It all had its problems, beautifully. Once it was finished, it was beautiful. But there are other ways of recording it, and the digital revolution is exactly that. So we've been looked after in the feature film industry, but also in the wannabe industry, in the short film industry. The digital revolution is extraordinary for that. We already know that I think a film called Tangerine has been shot on an iPhone 6. So when you can do that and you can edit on your Mac at home, lay your soundtracks, lay all of your supers in on your own home Mac, that's got to be incredible, because it costs students a bomb to do that in a laboratory on film. But now you can, and I've always said to people over the years, to students, don't worry about your equipment. That's the least of your worries. I never worried about it. People used to say, hey, that set of lenses is sharper than this set. And I'd say, yeah, but this set's got a better range. So I didn't mind it if the film came up and was a little grainy for the first 3 shots. It was going to be grainy for the whole film, so nobody would notice it. So after that, my belief was that an audience paying their money would come in with their popcorn and sit down, and after the first 3 shots of the film, they'd nestle in and say, now make me laugh and cry and take me away. And that's the important thing. So I'd say to students, don't worry about your equipment. Worry about your script and your structure and the length of it. Are you boring your film? Are the shots too long in your edit? Are they boring? Look at George's Mad Max. The average length of shot in the entire film is 2.3 seconds. A long shot's 5 seconds. You're bored out of your brain after 5 seconds, because we can, as a human, we can record that frame and scan it so quickly. Then after that, as George said, they'll start looking for mistakes. I'm going to cut it. So they can scan it and I've gone. So that way you keep that power up, you keep the impetus of energy up. So that's the important thing, and I think the digital revolution has given students of all ages and nationalities the ability to go out and make films. Not, show glossy films on the screen, although awards are given, but make films, because that's what comes first. And I remember, perfect example is my own son, who made a film years ago. I shot it for him, very technical. He was using green screens, and he put it together with friends in the industry and worked hard at it. And we showed it to Anthony Minghella, the great Anthony Minghella. And Anthony was so lovely. He gave my son a hug and he said, that film proves you know technically what to do. He said, now go and put 2 people against a brick wall and make me cry. And that's what he's just done. So to me, that was the greatest piece of advice Anthony could have given my son, and I want to pass it on at all times, because to me, that's the essence of filmmaking, is 2 people against a brick wall and make the audience cry. That is filmmaking.
So I think, ladies and gentlemen, we can't have a better quote to wrap this up. I want to stay a little moment with Minghella, because John just comes back from Rome, where they had what he himself called kind of a family reunion, and that's now that we've heard him talk, we know what he means by that. Of the people who worked on Minghelle's film, I think the celebration was around the release of a new Blu-ray. He just told me before we started the interview. So, together with what you heard him say about his career and the way he's worked along his career, let me please ask you for a tremendous applause for this man.
Thank
Well
you.
done, man.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
As you can see, I've come bearing gifts. But first, let me say, it would have been very easy for me to have pushed the locks down on my car and have driven around all day and all night with this man. Now, I've got a gift. I've got a gift for John. But he's not getting the gift until he tells you very quickly the story of Dustin Hoffman and Raymond on the park bench and your suggestion for how Dustin needed to find Raymond's character. You recall that?
Oh yeah, it was a moment, I think, in pre-production when Dustin said he hadn't found, a week out of shooting, and he hadn't found Raymond. I haven't found Raymond. So we started shooting, and it was a very simple scene with Tom and Dustin sitting on a park bench looking at some ducks, I think it was. And then Tom's character stands up and says, "Come on, we're going." And he walks diagonally across to the footpath over the grass. And Dustin jumped up and in his little bird-like manner and followed. And I must confess, I thought to myself, would Raymond do that? Would Raymond just follow there, or would his analytical mind say, I've got to go to the footpath, then follow? And I didn't know whether to, you know, working with Dustin 3 days in, and didn't know whether to be bold enough to go and suggest that. And then I thought, oh, well, you only live once, better give it a go. So I just said to Dustin, would Raymond follow there or go to the path? And he just went, oh my God. He said, I've got a cameraman who's thinking for me, and I'm his best mate. Used to ring every week.
There you go.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Wrong way round, man. Wrong way round. Thank you. Thank you.
How's that? Thank you very much.
Funny, isn't it?
Hopefully that's the only mistake I've made in preparation for this film festival. Hopefully you won't notice we drop reel 3 out tonight.
We might swap back door, you know.
Yeah, we might swap again. So, this is a dream come true for me. I wanted to be a cinematographer when I left high school, and my parents didn't know what a cinematographer was. They told me to go and get a trade. Pretty much the kind of job avenues that were available to John. So I said, bugger that, and I taught myself to write software. But when Marilyn and Greg and I sold our software engineering business, Marilyn said, you need something to occupy your brain, otherwise you're going to implode and you're going to drive me crazy. So I became a boy filmmaker at age 58.
Good thing it's now a proper job.
And that's what's motivated me for 13 months, for this to be the culmination of all of that effort, to have gentlemen who create landmark films with us for our inaugural Noosa International Film Festival. I'm close to tears. Thank you very much.
Thank you.